Okay, hello and welcome to the second meeting of the Turba online discussion group on the history of alchemy broadly defined. I'm Joe Hedesan from University of Oxford, the organizer of the Turba, and I am pleased to introduce today's session on poisons and alchemy. We are fortunate to have with us two experts in the field coming us from over the Atlantic, Alisha Rankin from Tufts University and Yan Liu from SUNY Buffalo. Before I begin, just some quick administrative matters. To the best extent possible, if you could keep your video on and the sound off. I will be taking questions in the following manner: either signal them in the chat or raise your hand virtually. If you're on YouTube, you can also write in the chat box, of course. I am to keep the meetings a maximum of 1 hour and a half. Finally, a quick thank you to the Society of the History of Alchemy and Chemistry for providing its Zoom and YouTube accounts for our use. I will start the session by introducing first Alisha Rankin. I'm very pleased to announce that Alisha has just been promoted to Professor of History at Tufts University. So congratulations, Alisha.
Thank you. Thank you. I am not supposed to use the title till July, but it's official and done, so yay.
Well, I mean, we are all happy to hear that, and it's certainly richly deserved. So Alisha is also co-editor of the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. Her research spans a wide range of topics in early modern science and medicine, including gender, pharmacy, alchemy, poison, experiment, translation, and time. She is the author of 2 books, Panaceas' Daughters, Noble Women as Healers in Early Modern Germany, published with Chicago in 2013, which won the Gerald Strauss Prize for Reformation History in 2014, and The Poison Trials, Wonder Drugs, Experiment and the Battle for Authority in Renaissance Science, also with Ashgate Press. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping a line. Chicago Press 2021. She co-edited Secrets and Knowledge in Medicine and Science, 1500 to 1800, with Ashgate in 2011. I was thinking Ashgate doesn't sound right because it was taken by Routledge in something like 2014. And has published numerous articles on early modern science, medicine, and alchemy. Alisha will offer a talk entitled A Universal Cure, Poisoned Antidotes, Alchemy, and Panaceas in Early Modern Europe. And I will also introduce Yan Liu because he will talk first about medieval China, so it will be chronological. And Yan Liu, I hope I pronounced that right, is assistant professor in history at SUNY Buffalo. He specializes in the history of medicine in medieval China with a focus on pharmacology, religious healing, the history of the senses and emotions, and the global transmission of medical knowledge. His first book, Healing with Poisons, Potent Medicines in Medieval China, was published by University of Washington Press in 2021, and it is available in open access. The book offers a cultural history of poisons as healing agents in the formative age of Chinese pharmacology, so that's 200 to 800 CE. Highlighting the shifting boundary between medicines and poisons as shaped by technical, political, and religious conditions. His second book, Project, explores the circulation of aromatics, saffron, camphor, etc., and olfactory knowledge along the Silk Roads from the 7th century to the 13th century. Yan will speak first, and his talk is called Dying to Live, Elixirs and the Transformation of the Body in Medieval Chinese Alchemy. So please, Yan, at your convenience, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe, for your very nice introduction. Can you hear me? I see some echoing, actually.
Yes, everything is fine. Yes.
Okay. And thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful program. And thank you all for coming to the lecture. So now I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. Okay. So you can see my screen, right? So. Okay. So as Joe nicely introduced just now, that I specialize in medieval Chinese medicine because of the intimate connection between medicine and alchemy. In the book I published last year, I also explored in one chapter the use of poisons in Chinese alchemy, which is the focus of today's talk. I want to start it with a figure named Sun Simiao, who is a well-known, celebrated physician and alchemist living in the 7th century China. And in one of his familiar books produced to the end of 7th century, he said that among the myriad things in the world, nothing cannot be medicine. So according to him, there was no essential difference between medicine and non-medicines. Anything could be a drug in the proper context. And if we look into the vast pharmacopoeia of China in the pre-modern period, we see the pharmacopoeia incorporate a large number of substances of diverse origins. Perhaps surprising to some of us, it also includes many poisons. Giving you some examples. For example, aconite is a highly toxic plant, was also one of the most frequently prescribed medicines in Chinese pharmacy. Other examples include python's gallbladder in the category of animal products, and cannabis in the category of foods. But I also want to highlight there's a category of mineral drugs. The one prominent example is cinnabar, or dansha in Chinese. And we know that this substance was not just frequently used as a medicine, but also as a chemical ingredient, which I'll come back in a minute. So the reason, the foundation of this prominent use of poisons in Chinese pharmacy, right in this foundation idea of the concept of du in China. This word du in modern context can be readily translated into the English word poison, very similar to the connotation of poison in English, which invites this association of danger, harm, and intrigue, very negative word. But in the pre-modern context, this word actually carried a variety of meanings, oftentimes opposite meanings. For example, according to a 1st century dictionary, its basic meaning was thickness, which referred to the lofty mountain. So thickness implies potency, abundance, intensity. It didn't carry a obvious negative sense. And this meaning of sickness actually was well preserved in medical texts in pre-modern China. From very early on, I think it carried a strong sense of potency in medical writings. That doctors from early on in China, they recognized that a drug possessing du, on the one hand, can surely harm as a poison, but also it had the potential to cure as a medicine. So instead of avoiding these powerful substances altogether, doctors in China developed a variety of medical techniques to transform these powerful substances into therapeutic agents. And that's precisely the focus of the book I just published, as Joe mentioned earlier, Healing with Poisons, Potent Medicines in Medieval China. Basically, it's a book that explores this important but rather forgotten tradition of using poisons in Chinese pharmacy from the 3rd to the 8th century, which is the formative age of Chinese pharmacology. And the book contains 3 units or 3 parts. And the first 2 parts explore the use of poisons to cure illnesses, examining technical transformation of poisons, as well as its varied applications in social and political realms. But the 3rd part actually goes beyond the use of poison to treat. illnesses and explored this higher end of using poisons to enhance the body and prolong life. And particularly in the last content chapter, I discussed the prominent use of poisons in Chinese alchemy in the first millennium with this higher goal of enhancing the body. And I'll come back to explain what that means or meant for Chinese alchemists at the time. A little bit background of the period of time I study in China. So this about 800 years of history can be divided into two halves, roughly speaking. The first half of this period is called era of division. As you can see that there is a division of political regimes between the north and south, where the northern part was occupied by various nomadic groups from Central and Northern Asia of Turkic, Tibetan or Mongolian origins, while in the south, a succession of regimes established by the Han people occupied that region. Interestingly, in terms of the history of medicine, we find quite a lot of medical texts, pharmacological writings, alchemical writings, produced in this area called Jiangnan, the southeastern region, where the medical knowledge and alchemical practice were primarily produced and practiced within the aristocratic families and transmitted across generations within family, lineage. And that situation changed in the following centuries when the unified empires of Sui and Tang shifted the political power from the southeast part to the northwest with the new capital Chang'an. And with this elevation of the state power, the state became more interested in promoting medical knowledge, and quite a few emperors were also personally very interested in alchemical practice, who sponsored the expensive enterprise of alchemical operations, and also the easy circulation of the alchemical ingredients across empire make such practice more easy to do for a wider society. So it's a very different kind of situation in the Tang, and partly explained that the flourishing of the alchemical practice during this period time. So I want to focus the first period, the era division, and I'll tell you a story. So a story of about an alchemist, a young alchemist that lived in the early 6th century. Sorry. So the location of this event took place again in the southeastern region, in the mountain called Maoshan, Mount Mao. And the central character of this story is alchemist named Zhou Ziliang, who was interested in Taoist practice, and particular the compounding of elixirs to prolong his life. So on the morning of the date I just showed you, in 516, Zhou Ziliang got up and he took a bath with scented water and changed his clothes, right? So put on the clean clothes, and he was about to perform some kind of purification ritual. And then his younger brother showed up and asked for a medicine for their sick aunt who lived nearby. And Zhou Ziliang told his brother that actually I was preparing something for myself to ingest as medicine. I'm sick myself, so can you just come back later? So his brother left and came back later with the suspicious aunt and mother, and they find actually Zhou Ziliang lying on the ground. So what have you done? What have you done? They wailed. And Ziliang raised his hand and snapped his fingers 3 times, right? So he said, don't cry out, don't cry out. You are ruining my great affair. Soon after that, he stopped breathing. When he died, the frankincense he ignited earlier in the morning was still burning in the censer. He was only 20-years old. So this story actually was recorded in a diary of Zhou Ziliang, who was collected by his master Tao Hongjing, that I'll come back in a minute. And we actually know that the thing that killed him actually refer to alchemical product, often referred to as elixir or dan in Chinese. And we actually know the composition of this elixir in this case, which is called ninefold perfected jade liquor elixir, which consists of two ingredients. One is a special kind of mushroom called Ganoderma, which is not toxic. And the other one is cinnabar, as I introduced earlier, which is a mercury compound, which is probably the thing that killed Zhou Ziliang. So the death of Zhou Ziliang was not unique upon elixir poisoning. Quite a few alchemists during and after his time, as well as several Chinese emperors, died of elixir poisoning. And so this tradition of compounding and ingesting elixirs in China in the first millennium is often referred to as outer alchemy, white done, with two goals, right? This outer alchemy set up sophisticated procedures and elaborate devices to compound something called elixir, ingesting of which can achieve longevity, if not immortality. But one goal, I think I want to mention that just for this audience, is transmutation of metals, which is similar to the goal of alchemy in medieval and early modern Europe, right? So changed metal, the base metals into the gold and silver. That's there. But the more prominent goal, as I just mentioned, is this goal of, upon ingesting these elixirs, to transform the body. And this practice actually lasted for a very long time, lasting about a millennium from the Han period to the Tang period. And I want to give you just some kind of material evidence of the practice of alchemy during this period. This is 8th century material objects excavated from a Tang aristocratic family, a sort of a jar store from a storage of the family in the capital of the Tang. You can see on the left, you have a collection of a particular type of cinnabar there. And the white part is agate. It's a particular kind of a jewel. And this cinnabar is called the large piece brilliant cinnabar. And there are 7 different kind of boxes like this, each with a particular type of cinnabar with different quality, indicating a pretty sophisticated connoisseurship of cinnabar at the time. And you can see that on the right side, it's a crucible or a vessel where the practitioner can use it for alchemical operation. And there are some traces of burning from the exterior, indicating it's actually being used for doing alchemy. The previous scholarship on the study of Chinese alchemy has been, abundant. The early scholarship focused on the connection between outer alchemy and science, particularly chemistry. This is similar, in the study of alchemy in Europe. There's a lot of scholars working on that, relationship and transition from alchemy to chemistry in early modern Europe. And such effort in Chinese context has been pioneered by, for example, Joseph Needham and his collaborators to try to identify certain modern chemical elements in ancient Chinese alchemy, right? So this approach has been challenged by later scholars such as Mason Sivan, which really try to understand Chinese alchemy from their own culture medium, such as identifying the theoretical foundations and ritual significance of performing alchemy that is quite different from the framework of modern science. Alchemy is also quite strongly connected to Taoism, and Sivan argued that not every alchemist belonged to the Taoist sect, but on the other hand, many Taoists actually were involved in alchemy. So we know the development of religious Taoism started from roughly the 3rd century after the collapse of the Han Dynasty. After that, during the era of division, many different schools of Taoism developed, and particular one called Great Clarity, Taiqing, developed in the 4th and 5th century, and prominently in this tradition of Taoism, a lot of alchemical writings appear. And the Taoist scholar Fabrizio Pregadio wrote an important book on the study of this particular tradition, Great Clarity, and investigating the alchemical writings, particularly the various rituals involved in that tradition. So, and my work actually is building upon Pregadio's earlier book on this study. In the Taoist context, I also want to comment briefly on this concept of xian, which is often translated as transcendent or immortal, because basically the ultimate goal for these Taoists to ingest elixirs is to achieve immortality. But what does it mean, right? What does immortality mean in medieval Chinese context, particularly in Taoist context? And I want to emphasize this is based on the earliest Taoist scholars' studies, that there are this conception of heaven and earth as both layered and form as a continuum, right, between the celestial and terrestrial worlds. So an adept of Taoist practitioner, a Taoist practitioner, upon ingesting elixir or upon other approaches of Taoist practice, that body can ascend to a higher layer or higher level of the being, depends on the level of the accomplishments. And the higher the person ascends, the longer the person can live. So there's a correspondence between the lifespan and level of ascension. So thinking about this idea of immortality in Taoist context, we can think of death or immortality not as something static, right, clear cut from this life, actually form a continuum. And it's a more dynamic picture of the rising or falling across these various layers of the being. That is ultimate picture we can keep in mind, right? So, and that's definitely, has something to do with the transformation of the body upon ingesting elixirs, right? So, finally, so this is my intervention in my book. That is a connection between alchemy and medicine, or medical alchemy, particularly the connection to the transformation of the body. And a fundamental puzzle of the history of alchemy in China is that how do we explain the enduring passion for elixirs given their alarming toxicity? Toxicity is not something that the alchemists in medieval China were not aware of. Actually, they were fully aware of this, and they developed different kind of interpretations, different kind of responses to deal with it. So I developed this approach, the so-called elixir, the body upon ingesting elixirs and its transformation, as a window to see the debates where different kind of body responses induced by elixir actually sometimes either justified or in other times contested the power of elixirs. And as a way to these people actually develop a further understanding of not just elixirs, but the use of powerful minerals as medicines, as alchemical ingredients in medieval China. So I want to come back to another figure to explain further my approach of using the perspective of the body and body transformation to understand Chinese alchemy and medicine. This figure is called Tao Hongjing, who lived around the same time as the first figure I introduced, the young Zhou Ziliang, who died of elixir poisoning. And Tao actually was the master of Zhou Ziliang. So they came from the same region in the south east region. They came from the same mountain, actually. The Tao also resided in the mountain of Maoshan and devoted himself to Taoist practice toward the end of the 5th century. He was also very interested in alchemy, but he tried to develop some kind of sophisticated formulas to compound elixirs. But the resources were quite expensive at the time, partly because of this price, partly because of they are far away from where he lived. Because of the political division here, it's kind of hard to acquire ingredients from northern regions. For these various reasons, he was not able to practice alchemy for a long time. But the situation changed. This is the Maoshan where he resided. The situation changed. A new emperor came to the power. This is the first emperor of the new dynasty, Liang. And even before he became emperor, he had a good relationship with Tao Hongjing, right? While Tao Hongjing was, sort of hiding in the mountains, he maintained this relationship with emperor and even offered some kind of advice for his political ruling. So once the emperor became the new leader, he was very interested in alchemy, and he sponsored Tao Hongjing to produce elixir for him, and with a lavish supply of all the ingredients he needed. So with that imperial support, Tao started his alchemical practice in the early 6th century. He particularly relied on this formula called reverted elixir in 9 cycles, which includes 7 different ingredients, and the last 4 on the bottom are all toxic. Realgar and orpiment are 2 different kinds of arsenic compound. And based on a Taoist treatise and the biography of Tao Hongjing, we can reconstruct the alchemical procedure of Tao Hongjing. Basically, this is a simplified version of that procedure. He constructed a chamber first and set up a furnace in the chamber, and he made a large vessel which incorporated all the required ingredients, and he sealed vessel, and then initiated a carefully controlled 90 days of firing in 9 cycles. So it takes a long time, actually. In the first 6 cycles, he gradually moved the fire closer and closer and closer to the vessel, and then for the rest of the time, keep the fire constant and just keep burning it. So after this 90 days of operation, something happened in the vessel, and eventually he collected the residue, pounded it, and mixed with honey to produce something we call elixir, right? So this elixir has a appearance of frost and snow. That's the original language. His disciples were all very excited, claiming that this is the success. But the master, the Tao, actually said this is not quite such a success, because he was expecting an elixir radiating variegated colors, not just a dull color of whiteness. And this is his original words, that if a complete elixir doesn't radiate variegated colors, it is a potent elixir. One who ingests it will die temporarily. In a moment, he rises and disappears. So I want to direct your attention to this particular term, potent elixirs. Potent here is the Chinese word du, right? So you can see that the du meaning of du, as I explained earlier, actually is well manifested in this alchemical context. On the one hand, a du or elixir with du is not the best elixir. It's inferior because it doesn't radiate variegated colors. But on the other hand, it can make one die temporarily and make one rise and disappear. And this phenomenon of die temporarily and rise and disappear, it's probably referring to a Taoist concept of corpse deliverance. And the idea is an accomplished master died first, and his body disappeared later, and only leaving some paraphernalia in the coffin, such as the clothes, sword, talisman, indicating the death is only an ostensible death. Ultimately, the master had achieved transcendence, elevating himself to a higher state of being, right? When I explained the layered heaven and earth before. And this often, there's metaphor used to describe corpse deliverance, such as the molting of the snake skin, cicada leaving behind its shell, indicating there's a sense of metamorphosis of the body happening here. But transcendence came with a price. When we look at another alchemical text, or Taoist text, to be more accurate, Taoist text, including the information about elixirs, written by Tao Hongjing, we find a formula called powder of leaving the belt behind by the true man of Grand Supreme. It's a beautiful name for elixir, but the actual experience of ingesting elixir is not so nice. So actually, there's records of this, right? So once a person ingests elixir, he feels a piercing pain in the heart, and he craves for the water in the following 3 days, upon indicating, there's a tremendous heat produced in the body. And once imbibing a large amount of water, the person, the qi of the person get exhausted, indicating the termination of life. But again, the narrative goes on to say the coffin becomes empty, and the only thing find there is a clothes from the master, so indicating this transcendence or the corpse deliverance. But I would say from the 5th to 3rd century on, we have different kind of responses to elixir taking, making this journey to transcendence rather daunting. So one example I want to share with you, this is from the story from the Tang period, retelling this Taoist master named Wei Boyang. He goes to the mountain, bring 3 disciples, and compounding an elixir. And once that elixir is made, he announced that elixir is potent elixir. Again, we see this potent word for du, right? It's a potent elixir. And this is interesting detail here. Before trying himself or trying on his disciples, actually he gave it to a dog. So this is a poison trial on the animal. Nod to Alisha's talk later. So, but this is in a very different context of Taoist narrative. So the dog dies, and so 2 disciples see this, and they get scared and they just flee away. So this is not for them. But the 3rd one, this one depicted here, he is an unflinching disciple. He's still determined to ingest the elixir together with his master, and eventually they, of course, achieve transcendence. This is a typical hagiography of Taoist narrative, persuading the readers to overcome apparent death to achieve the final transcendence. But we can already see some misgivings among alchemists at the time. They have different responses to the elixir. For example, Tao Hongjing himself, even he compounded the elixir for the emperor, he himself never took elixir, and he lived, 81 years old. And even for the emperor, who was so avidly pursuing elixir, one time an alchemist presented elixir to him. Instead of ingesting the elixir, he actually commissioned the building of a new house and placed the elixir at the center and worshipped the elixir on auspicious days. Not denying the power of elixir, he turned that into a ritual object that he still hoped can bring some benefits to him. Later sources provide more detailed description of the body sensations induced by the elixir, often framed in medical languages. So this is a source produced in mid-8th century in the Taoist canon, written by a certain a given master Chuze. And we know nothing about this author, but based on the title of this source, particularly the word Greek clarity, Tai Ching, as I mentioned before, this probably is in the canon of the Tai Ching tradition, the Greek clarity tradition, with strong emphasis on alchemical operations. And this source included a variety of recipes of preparing elixirs and also the bodily sensations induced by some of these elixirs. This section called sensations and stirrings upon ingesting elixirs is really what I focus on here. And I just give you some passages from this section. Upon ingesting the elixir, one feels his body and face itching as if worms are crawling in them. His hands and feet are swollen. He finds food stinky, eating, which makes him nauseated and vomit. His forelimbs are weak. Sometimes he has diarrhea. Sometimes he vomits. He has headache and pain in the abdomen. So I just highlight these words, description of the body sensations in our eyes, it's pathological that, it's certainly, it's a problem induced by the toxic substances here. But what's interesting is that the text continues that one should not take these signs as they manifest the efficacy of the elixir to eliminate illnesses. Right? So rather than considering these signs as pathological, they consider them to be the positive signs of the efficacy of the elixir. And this is not something entirely new, new interpretation. Actually, the text explicitly cites an ancient text called Book of Documents, in which it says if the medicine doesn't cause dizziness, it cannot cure illness. So this is not something specific to elixirs induced body experience. For a powerful medicine, such interpretation can be already found in ancient period. Right? Rather than doubting the efficacy of the medicine or elixir, these violent sensations, they become sort of affirmation of its power of purifying the body of these various illnesses to achieve health, if not the ultimate transcendence. So to conclude my talk today, so for my whole book, I try to problematize the rigid division between poison and medicine. I didn't see that rigid division in Chinese medicine and alchemy. I find rather the border is rather blurred, depends on the context, depends on the techniques of transformation, depends on the social political environment, but also depends on the bodily experience of the particular elixir. And this is the focus of today's talk. Is the crucial role of the body in assessment of elixirs for a variety of alchemists in medieval China. And the assessment invited various interpretations of elixir. Sometimes it's affirmation of its efficacy. Sometimes it's sort of contesting the power of that elixir. So it's opened up a space for the discussion among various alchemists to use the knowledge of the body as a cultural marker to study elixirs and relatedly the power of the mineral ingredients. And that leads to my second point, that is this entangled relationship between medicine and religion, that all the actors introduced in this talk, they were not just alchemists producing elixirs, but they also wrote medical and pharmacological writings that proved to be influential. And of course, the Taoist pursuit of transcendence or immortality is somewhat different from the medical writers' focus on curing illness, although that boundary was never really clear cut. But that being said, we see that there's a very fluid exchange of knowledge of the power of particularly mineral substances between alchemical texts and medical texts that further understanding of these substances as medical substance, right? So even if the practice of alchemy eventually died out from the 10th century on, the use of the powerful medicine, including powerful minerals such as cinnabar, arsenic, continued in Chinese medicine for centuries to come. And that's something I find is quite interesting. So with that, I would like to end my talk today, and I'll give it to Alisha. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ian. That was very fascinating talk. Thank you very much. And Alisha, again, will remind you that she will offer a talk entitled A Universal Cure, Poison Antidotes, Alchemy, and Panaceas in Early Modern Europe. So now we're moving a bit further, and without much further ado, Alisha.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's
okay.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect, great. And can you see a different picture now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, it's working then. Okay. All right, so thank you so much for inviting me to talk here. The material from this talk is drawn from the last chapter of my book, pictured here, although I'm adding in some material culture aspects that I didn't have time to really address in the book. And I've been doing a lot of presentations on the book, which is in general about testing poison antidotes. But this is the first time I'm presenting this particular chapter, which is more about the sort of transfer between poison antidotes to panaceas and methods of proof. So in Germany in the 1580s and 1590s, alchemy had a big role to play in conversations about these things. So in 1583, an empiric named Andreas Berthold of Oschatz published a work in Latin praising the virtues of a marvelous new German drug, which was a clay that he called the German Terra Sigillata. In both name and outward form, he said it mimicked the highly prized Terra Sigillata from Lemnos, which was an ancient remedy for poison, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Berthold presented the new clay as a substitute that resembled and was perhaps even superior to the original. Unlike the original, this Terra Sigillata was a Paracelsian remedy. Berthold called it Axungia solis, or grease of the sun, a poison antidote that Paracelsus briefly mentioned in his Great Surgery. But this Alishan Terra Sigillata, or the German Terra Sigillata, was good for far more than just poison. It could heal plague and dysentery, it could still bleeding, calm inflammations, heal wounds and burns, it comforted the heart, refreshed the brain, and kept diseases from the inward parts. It could even heal the common cold. Now, we might expect that such lofty claims would have been disregarded, but Berthold had an ace up his sleeve. He claimed that his readers did not have to trust him on his bare words because he had proof of the drug's effects. He concluded his book with 3 testimonial letters from powerful figures, 2 German princes and 1 town mayor, about trials they had conducted on the drug in 1580 and 1581. In all 3 cases, learned physicians had given poison to test subjects. 2 used dogs, 1 used a condemned criminal, followed by the Terra Sigillata. In every case, the subjects who were given the Terra Sigillata survived the poison. The dogs who had only been given poison and no antidote all died. So this impressive result seemed conclusive enough as to instantly cause a high demand for the drug and a shortage of it. Berthold published the official testimony of these tests as evidence of the German Terra Sigillata being both true and proven. Okay, so the year before Berthold published this book, so in 1582, a report appeared of another kind of Terra Sigillata called the Terra Sigillata Amwaldina, named after its creator, an alchemical empiric named Georg Amwald. Amwald's Terra Sigillata was not dug from the earth, however. He had made it himself through a secret alchemical process. Like the German Terra Sigillata, the Terra Sigillata Amwaldina was both a plague remedy and a poison antidote, as well as a remedy for dozens of ailments. Amwald specifically called it a universal medicine. He too mentioned a trial. If anyone doubted its usefulness, he said, they could just try it on a dumb animal using poison. But he mentioned this possibility merely as an aside. Most of this treatise was dedicated to the details of administering the remedy in various different illnesses. At the end, however, Amwald invoked a different kind of approbation. There were, he noted, some, quote, so-called doctors who did not recognize the virtues and efficacy of his Terra Sigillata. But he claimed he had silenced these naysayers by, quote, stuffing their mouths full with many exempla from the many thousands who gave me their testament. Bohemians, Bavarians, Swabians, Austrians, Palatines, Allgäuers, Bodensers, and residents of many other regions, he claimed, had sent word of the drug's success. So I'd like to use the example of these sort of 2 different kinds of Terra Sigillata and the 2 alchemists, Berthold and Amwald, to illustrate the merging of poison antidotes and alchemical elixirs in the 16th century. I argue that the traditions of poison antidotes and alchemical elixirs started out very separately, they had commonalities that allowed alchemical empirics to co-opt Terra Sigillata as an alchemical cure-all. And in the chapter in the book, there is it centers around methods of proof, the differing methods of proof that I introduced here. But I'm not in this sort of brief talk. I'm not going to have much time to really delve into that part of the argument. But I'm really happy to address questions about that in the Q&A, and I will get into it a little bit. But what I'm interested in talking about here is really the confluence of poison antidotes with alchemical panaceas. And in the 1590, as we'll see, Amvald expanded this idea of the poison antidote and cure-all terra sigillata into a true alchemical panacea. So just a quick note on our two alchemists, Berthold and Amvald. Both men appear, we don't have a lot of biographical details on either of them, but we do have a little on both. Both men appear to have come from rather humble backgrounds, but both managed to get an education. So Amvald came from Passau. He was the son of a bookseller. He eventually studied law in Basel and received a degree as a legal licentiate, but then somehow never practiced law, but instead got a position as a town physician in the Bavarian city of Meiningen and then in Donauwörth. Berthold's background is even less clear, but he came from Oschatz, which is near Dresden in Saxony. He later worked in Stettin, or now Szczecin, in Poland, but then Germany, in the 1570s as a school teacher and calligrapher, and he also was highly literate in Latin. A couple of his publications are in Latin. He later became a mine foreman in Silesia, and how that happened, I have no idea. But in short, both men were literate in Latin, so they don't really fit into the model of the sort of educationless market empiric. They were both educated, they just didn't have formal training in medicine. And both men capitalized on the broader interest in poison antidotes and panaceas in late 16th century Germany. So there's a long tradition of certain poison antidotes having panacea-like qualities. The most famous example is theriac, which was an ancient antidote, particularly promoted by Galen in the 2nd century, but then used by physicians through the 19th century as primarily a poison antidote, but also used for many other diseases and also as a prophylactic. From the 14th century, exotic substances like bezoar and unicorn horn, which both had traditions as poison antidotes, began to be recommended for plague, so following the plague epidemic from 1348, and then slowly and additionally for other poisonous diseases. So you particularly see this happening throughout the 16th century, that these drugs, which were originally poison antidotes and then expanded to be poison antidotes also good for plague, which was considered a poisonous disease, suddenly began to expand to be useful for a whole bunch of other things that didn't necessarily have to do with poison or plague. So at the same time that this was happening, there was also an increasing interest in alchemical elixirs. So these are very different kinds of elixirs than the kind that Jan was talking about. There's no temporary death, I think, intended from these elixirs. So an influential treatise falsely attributed to the Catalan Franciscan Ramon Llull, and described a stone or universal medicine that could transmute metals, cure all disease, and stimulate growth in plants. Another medieval Franciscan, John of Rupertissa, wrote extensively on a distilled medical liqueur called the Quinta Essentia, which also had marvelous medical properties. So both of these medieval Franciscans were very influential on the German surgeon and apothecary Hieronymus Brunschwig, who published 2 extremely influential books of distillation in the early 1500s. Intellectually, these distilled wonder cures came from a very different place than the poison antidote cure-alls. So the poison antidotes really came from the tradition of traditional Galenic medicine, academic medicine. The way that they operated was a little different than the Galenic humoral theory, but there was a scholarly tradition of the method of operation for occult cures in the Galenic tradition. Whereas the alchemical elixirs obviously came from the alchemical tradition, which was quite separate and outside the universities. Nevertheless, they had a number of things in common. They operated through occult powers, they worked on people of all humoral complexions, and they flourished particularly at the princely courts. And that was actually true. All of these things have been true since the Middle Ages. The papal court in Avignon had a really strong interest in alchemy and in poison antidotes, for example, but this all really expanded in the 16th century. And Terra Sigillata was an example of a real merging of these two traditions, a very direct merging. So Terra Sigillata, which literally means sealed earth, had been known as a poison antidote since antiquity. And in its ancient form, it was also seen as a cure for some digestive ailments and as a means to staunch blood. So it did have some properties beyond poison, curing poison, but it wasn't quite as expansive as theriac. Galen was very interested in finding out more about Terra Sigillata. So the original Terra Sigillata was found on a particular hillside in the island of Lemnos, at that point Greece and then later Turkey. And it was dug up once a year, formed into medallions, and stamped or sealed with the image of the goddess Diana. So Galen describes how he traveled twice to Lemnos to try to find the Terra Sigillata. The first time he landed on the wrong side of the island and was not able to find it. But on a subsequent trip, he made it there and he brought back a huge quantity of the Terra Sigillata. So you can see the form of it here, which is really the basic form that applies to all Terra Sigillata. There's little medallions. This is potentially, so this is from the Basel, this image here is from the Basel Pharmacy Museum, where most of my images come from. And they think that this might be an actual exemplar of the Lemnian Terra Sigillata stamped with Diana, because they haven't done a full analysis of it chemically, but they think it's quite old and it has a seated woman, so the image would fit. In any cases, Terra Sigillata was known in sources in the European Middle Ages, but was very rare. The actual specimens were very rare because of the problem of supply. After the Ottomans captured Lemnos in the 1450s, they tried to introduce a more formal Terra Sigillata trade into Europe. But we have a bunch of specimens today of Terra Sigillata stamped with these Turkish lettering. But concerns about fraud abounded in terms of the Turkish Terra Sigillata. And you see that appear in one European source after another. So kind of in response to this and the sort of interest in the ancient drug Terra Sigillata, you begin to see the emergence of a variety of European kinds of Terra Sigillata. Probably the most well-known of these initially was St. Paul's earth, also known as Maltese earth, which Catherine Park has written an article about, which began to be sold in the marketplace by a group known as the Pagliani, or the followers of St. Paul, who would perform all of these marketplace shows with snakes and poisoning, and they would use this earth to cure poison and poisonous diseases. So the inspiration for recasting this poison antidote Terra Sigillata as an alchemical drug, in discussing remedies for poisonous animal bites, Paracelsus briefly praised a kind of Terra Sigillata, which he called Axungia solis, as a remedy for bites of toads and spiders, as well as poisons like arsenic and mercury. This Terra Sigillata, which he described as formed into small medallions and stamped with a seal, drew its powers from metallic ore it contained, earth, so connected to the Pagliani, who I just mentioned, but that it was hard to find an authentic specimen, and he went into a long rant about the fraud perpetrated by current apothecaries. So that was just a very brief offhand reference, but it planted the seed, and that proved influential on a Silesian physician named Johannes Schultz or Johannes Montanus. An avid Paracelsian, Montanus claimed to have discovered a new kind of Paracelsian terra around 1550 in abandoned gold mines in the hills on the outskirts of the city of Striga or Strigoi in Silesia. He called this new earth the Silesian terra sigillata or Strigan terra sigillata sometimes. In many ways, Montanus made this clay more explicitly alchemical than Paracelsus's brief mention had done. He argued that Silesian terra sigillata drew its powers from gold, which was viewed by alchemists as the most perfect of metals and thus the most medicinally powerful. While Paracelsus described the Oxungia solis as white, the Silesian terra sigillata was yellow, which emphasized its golden virtues. This Silesian terra sigillata eventually ended up dominating the terra sigillata trade, and Montanus was generally credited as the creator. And this typical seal you see on the Silesian terra sigillata specimens is the one you see here, the mountain with cross keys, which was also on the poster for the Turba talks. The images are all examples of Silesian terra sigillata. These images of Montanus's head are actually a bit later. Those are not 16th century examples, but you do see them eventually. And I like this one here because you can see the mold that helps the stamp that helps make the terra sigillata. So it would be sort of pressed into the little medallion. So that's very rare to have that specimen. But despite Montanus's insistence that the Oxungia solis was gold, we have various colors we have red terra sigillata from Striga, we have a lot of white specimens, and then some kind of goldish colored specimens. So it came in many colors, not just gold. But the reason that the Silesian terra sigillata became so popular across Europe was partially due to our old friend Andreas Berthold, who I mentioned at the beginning, who clearly entered into some kind of partnership with Montanus. And as I already mentioned, he demonstrated the efficacy of Silesian terra sigillata or German terra sigillata in cities in Western Germany. So actually what Berthold appears to have been doing is selling his own kind of terra sigillata, not the Silesian variety. One of the testimonial letters describes what the seal looked like, and it's basically exactly what you see here, which is Andreas Berthold's initials on one side and his family shield that appears to be made up on the other side. So it's not the mountainous ones from Striga. But he also appended a treatise by Montanus to the book that he published in 1583, which described how Montanus had discovered the Silesian terra sigillata. So these two kinds of terra sigillata got conflated, which did not work to Berthold's benefit in the end, as we will see. And this treatise by Montanus was, it turned out, appended without Montanus's knowledge or permission, which eventually got Berthold in a lot of trouble with Montanus, and again, did not work to his benefit. But in any case, his demonstrations across Germany, which generated a lot of word of mouth knowledge, so there was a lot of letters exchanged about it, but also the book, which was published and rather popular, helped cement the idea of terra sigillata both as an alchemical cure and this Strigan terra sigillata as the gold standard of terra sigillata. Meanwhile, right around this time, in 1582, Georg Amwald published his own work on his own terra sigillata, which had properties very similar to Berthold's. So I have found no evidence that Berthold and Amwald knew each other. I strongly suspect that Amwald may at least have heard of the trials with the German terra sigillata just because it was being circulated in Germany at this time, and because it seems incredibly coincidental for him to have published a work at the exact same time about the exact same thing. I mean, there are a lot of varieties of terra sigillata appearing, but this is so close to Berthold's that it would seem a little too coincidental, but I don't have any direct evidence. And I have not found an actual specimen of Vald's Terra Sigillata, but there in a later work, there is an image of it, and that's what it looked like. So it was formed into medallions into the same shape as other kinds of Terra Sigillata, but he claimed to have made it alchemically. Vald himself was a colorful and controversial figure. He practiced as a physician without a license. He also got himself kicked out of Donauwörth for inciting unrest eventually. He ennobled himself by changing his name. So he was born Georg Amwald, or he's sometimes called Georg Baldinus. But he changed that to the more aristocratic sounding Georg Amwald. So the Am is a marker of nobility in Germany. And then eventually he got really fancy and decided to call himself Amund von Wald, which sounds even a level better. After he got himself kicked out of Donauwörth for inciting unrest, he eventually bought a manor house named Turnhofen, which is near the Bavarian city of Feuchtwagen, and it's about 45 miles from Donauwörth, it's just a pretty basic manor house, but he referred to it in his publications as a castle. So he appeared to his readers who weren't better aware as a knight, as a noble living in a castle. That was sort of his persona that he developed. His Terra Sigillata treatise went through 2 quick printings in 1582, but it does not appear to have garnered much success. But Vald later expanded this Terra Sigillata into a truly universal chemical medicine, which he called the Panacea Amwaldina. So he claimed that the Panacea Amwaldina was similar to the Terra Sigillata, but even better. So it's kind of based on the Terra Sigillata, but had even better properties. It could cure 116 different diseases and ailments, plague, poison plague, poisonous diseases, and the bites of poisonous animals were the first conditions that he mentioned and the ones that he described most fully. But they were just the first few of the rest. And this was no longer primarily a poison antidote with cure-all properties. This was a cure-all that had poison antidotes prominent among its curative properties. So he added a dizzying array of other illnesses, including dizziness, diarrhea, dysentery, syphilis, sciatica, dropsy. He said it could promote breast milk, drive out dead fetuses, restore memory, stop bleeding, and prevent people from becoming werewolves, among many, many, many other very basic things. So this was it was directly related to and deriving from the Terra Sigillata, but it was in some ways a completely different animal. So first of all, he referred to it as a panacea, and this is the first instance I found of an alchemical panacea called a panacea, using that word panacea, in early modern Europe. It was picked up on and expanded drastically in the 17th century, and you do see references to Amwald in some of those later publications, but I haven't found, and the word panacea was used most prominently in Giles Everard's publication on tobacco called De Herba Panacea, in, I believe, 1687. But this is directly following on that and using it as an alchemical, for alchemical reasons. And it was a great success. So it attracted a lot of interest from local physicians. The Würzburg physician Johannes Photius wrote to the Saxon court physician Joachim Camerarius asking his opinions of Amwald's claims, which he called, quote, admirable but hardly believable. And he was so interested in finding out whether there was something to it that he actually traveled to visit Amwald to see if there is anything to his claims. And came back and said Amwald had treated him very rudely and refused to tell him anything. But there is still a great interest in his cures. So learned physicians who are kind of coming from the other tradition were actually very interested in seeing whether this was, if there was anything to this. But despite the disdain with which the Panacea Amvaldina eventually was treated by learned physicians, it went through 3 quick printings, and Amvald made enough money off of it that he could afford to buy himself his manor house and get himself out of Donauwörth. And in the 1594 edition, he began to include a proof of a sort, so kind of so similar to the testimonial letters that Berthold included. He included his own testimonial letters, but they were a very different kind. His testimonies were testimonial letters from happy patients, or at least excerpts from letters. You can see, I mean, I might not be able to read the German, but a lot of these say extract. So they're just like extracts from them, which, you know, some happy patients complain that it was taken very much out of context. But in the reader who was just coming to this without that knowledge, it looked like he had all of these, testimonials. He also included testimonials from physicians, and most physicians did not agree with him at all. So these testimonial letters included from physicians caused a big controversy, particularly a controversy he got into with the physician Andreas Libavius, whose letter he included without permission. And Libavius was mainly asking more about the Panacea and was really angry to find that his letter was included in Berthold's book as an approbation of it, not just as a curiosity. And I'm happy to go into, that's a sort of large side story that I'm happy to elaborate on in the Q&A. But the basic point of all this is that in terms of commercial success, Amvald's tactic was very effective. Amvald continued to sell his Panacea from his manor house throughout the rest of his life, where he died in relative comfort in 1616. So he garnered enough interest for and actual commercial interest in his Panacea that he was able to live about a very comfortable life. Berthold, on the other hand, did not see much commercial benefit from the Terra Sigillata he helped to popularize. He published another treatise in 1594 complaining that he had been sidelined from the Silesian Terra Sigillata trade, and that seems to partially have come from Montanus's extreme irritation that Berthold had published this treatise from him without his knowledge. He didn't deny writing it, but he said it had been a draft, it hadn't been meant to publish in the form that it was published. And so eventually he seems to have just gotten rid of Berthold. And Berthold complained that he had no income because of that, because he was totally sidelined. So he had to try to find some other way to make money. He tried to, and he did so by trying to convince his reader with a pamphlet he published in 1594 that he had the true Terra Sigillata, that the Silesian Terra Sigillata, once he was out of the trade, was run by people who didn't know what they were doing. It was his own knowledge, his own sort of knowledge that helped transform the raw material of the clay into a true alchemical cure. So this is about sort of the arcana, and he even used the word arcanum in particular. He had the knowledge of the arcanum that helped to make it efficacious. So he continued to focus on Terra Sigillata as a poison antidote, but in this treatise, he really doubled down on the alchemical influence, and he discussed the way that the seven planets influenced the Terra Sigillata. You can see this little symbol here comes from a version of the treatise that he was a dedicatory copy to one of the Landgraves of Hesse. And he personally, I think he did this himself, colorized, because there's a handwritten note in his hand in it as well. He personally seems to have colorized it using gold paint. So you can I don't know how well you can see it, but the little stars are golden, and the border is also golden. So he's really trying to emphasize the role of gold and the role of the sort of alchemical process in making this a poison antidote. And he also emphasizes it as a useful drug for a variety of ailments. And in this little treatise, he doesn't at all mention the proofs that he did on people using on dogs and humans using poison. So that's not something that's even brought up there. He just mentions that it has been proven, but he doesn't say how. So it's more focusing more on the alchemy and the wonderful effects rather than the method of proof. He also wrote sad letters to various aristocrats with a similar message, which also emphasized the drug's usefulness in plague. But he really did not see much success with these methods, as far as I can tell. Somehow he found we kind of lose sight of him after about 1595. And the next thing we know of him, there's a note that he died in the public hospital in Freiburg in Saxony in 1610. So somehow he found himself back to his native Saxony. And the fact that he died in the public hospital suggests that he did not end up wealthy at the end of his life. Although the note also mentions that he gave his books and instruments and scientific instruments to the city of Freiburg. So he at least had some possessions, but he clearly didn't have much of a support network because he had no family to give them to. And his death in the hospital does not suggest much success. Oh yeah, there's his. Montanus, in contrast, became a local hero in Striga, and the Strigan Terrasigillata remained an important source of income for the city until the 19th century, when the mine of the Terrasigillata mines collapsed after an earthquake. So just to briefly conclude, these substances started out in similar places. They all started out as Terrasigillata medallions, but they ended up in very different places, and they're all viewed as having alchemical influences, but they ended up in very different places. The careful proofs that Berthold tried to lay out were secondary to Montanus's reputation in the end, and the Terrasigillata trade really was dominated by the Silesian Terrasigillata that Montanus promoted. Meanwhile, so that was sort of the Terrasigillata poison antidote side of it, which was generally used until the 19th century as primarily a poison antidote, but as a drug that also had many other effects. Meanwhile, Amwald's expansion of Terrasigillata into a panacea ended up having great success, but also generated many panacea copycats that had nothing to do with the Terrasigillata poison antidote tradition. So Terrasigillata was the point at which both of these traditions really merged, and then they kind of diverged again a bit. But overall, it demonstrates the great interest in both wonder drugs and panaceas from both the learned physician side and the alchemical side in the 16th century. I have a lot more to say, but I am already over my allotted time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to entertain questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alisha. That was wonderful. We enjoyed both presentations. They were very entertaining and very well researched, and I learned a lot about different aspects of poisons and elixirs. And well, what I was of course wondering was whether you might start off the discussion by thinking a little bit about the link between poisons and medicines, and the fact that obviously both of them have to have some kind of power associated to them. I mean, there is this element of power over the body or within the body that is essential. So, but at the same time, poisons, of course, risk of overcoming the body, right? I mean, they're just too powerful in some way for the human body. And of course, there is this, eye-opening example of Chu Ziliang, which shows that, well, I mean, even if it overcomes the body, that they can be seen as a good thing, which is, of course, not the case probably in the Western world, but it makes sense within a certain kind of religious perspective. So just wondering what your thoughts are on this, occult or power of medicines and poisons and how they're related.
Well, I guess I could go. I mean, Jan has probably even more to say on that than I do because this whole book is all about that. But I mean, it was definitely the very strongly the case in European medicines that poison antidotes, or many of them, included some poisonous substance that would help neutralize poison. So the flesh of venomous snakes was included in terra sigillata. Bezoar stone was seen as often described as being efficacious because the animal, so it was a calcinated clump formed in the stomachs of some animals. And one of the theories was that the animals ate both poisonous and healing herbs, and those would therefore mingle together in the bezoar, and that's why it worked. So in terms of the sort of action of poison antidotes, poisonous substances were really important. But I think Jan's work has much more on the actual use of poisons as directly as medicines, right, Jan?
Thank you, Alisha. So I also have many questions for your talk, but I'll save that for later. And thank you, Joe, for your question. That I think this idea of using poisons, not because of the sort of the toxicity as we understand today in the framework of the modern toxicology, but the sort of original sense in medieval China, which denotes potency or power as the word you use, is really at the core of the therapeutic rationale of using poisons in Chinese medicine. And there is a frame, a saying, I'll say, capture this rationale, which is using poison to counter poison. That is idea, for obstinate illnesses, you have to apply powerful remedies. These powerful remedies often involve use of what we see as toxic substances, but for them, it's really the site of exerting power. Of course, alchemy is a kind of extreme case that they try to achieve the ultimate transcendence and immortality, and it's ironic because they often die early. But in the medical realm, actually, the use of such as aconite, such as arsenic compound, their rationale there is more of using these powerful substances to cure diseases, to eliminate these diseases often manifested in the form of, for example, demonic possession, for example, vermin invasion. So this idea of purification, which I indicated toward the end of my talk, actually is well manifested in medical realm as well. So that's my short response to that.
I thought it was super interesting, though, how different the concept of elixir was in the Chinese alchemical understanding and the European alchemical understanding. I thought that was really just like this idea of transcendence is something I found super fascinating. And
yeah. So that's something I also would like to have a conversation with you and Jill and other people in the audience that whether there's a general conception that Chinese alchemy primarily focus on the transcendent aspect, and European alchemy is primarily focused on the transmutation of base metals into gold or silver. But as far as I understand, there's also a sort of a medical alchemy seeking the prolongation of life,
yes.
Not immortality as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you say this, wonderful drug, we have this kind of cure-all properties. I mean, I wonder that is also the aspect of the consideration, life enhancement, or even this higher goal.
Yeah. I thought the contrast between prolongation of life and then the temporary death that the Chinese elixir could induce, like a really interesting contrast.
Yeah, and I would add that obviously, Western alchemy is often thought as being mainly about transmutation, but obviously, very early on, you have this concept of elixir, which has this dual function of obviously transmuting and also healing the body. So, which is clearly from Islamic sources. And of course, my deeper question is whether there was a kind of connection between Islamic and Chinese alchemy at some point. That's kind of like the philosopher's stone of alchemy, I guess, to find out. But yes, and I mean, you feel that stronger and stronger as you come to the early modern period, that there is this focus on life prolongation. But of course, it's seldom that it's I mean, it's thought in terms of, well, it's okay to kill you because you'll go to this higher heaven, and it will be because, of course, you know, there is a difference between you know, let's say the ontological levels of the Chinese, you know, the heavens and the Western heavens. Of course, I mean, they're very, very different in a way. So, but it's a fascinating topic. So. Yeah, John, please, John Christie from Oxford, please ask your question if you'd like.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks very much indeed to both speakers. This is a very, very interesting session, I thought. I have a different question for each of you. For Jan, it's to do with the idea of potency. And I just wondered if in the preparation of such material, there's a conception of dosage, which is in some sense quantified or not. That is, it's a really simple, straightforward question, I suppose. Does potency depend upon quantities of certain ingredients? In the traditions that you've been looking at. And Alisha, I was interested in the variety and functions of the seals on the sealed earth. Why were they there, and why were they so various? Yeah, can you say a bit about that? I'd just be interested to know. Thank you both.
So I can try to answer your question first, John. Thanks for that great question. Dosage is definitely quite important, and both medical works and alchemical works I examined during the period I studied, it is a factor. So from early on in pharmacological writings, for example, they particularly discuss the importance of potency, particularly for the drugs possessing dual or with potency. So, and they generally have this guideline of starting with some small dosage, and if again, using the body response of the patients as a factor for calibrating the dosage. They recommend increasing the doses gradually until the patient's body is healed. So that's the sort of a general criteria provided by physicians. In alchemy, I find this interesting, I would say, increasing awareness of the dosage of certain alchemical ingredients, particularly during the Tang period. Here I'm referring to cinnabar, actually. So they did try to lower the dosage of the cinnabar ingredients. And I tend not to use the word detoxify because that would completely eliminate the power of elixir altogether. But they were aware of this issue and try to tame the power of elixirs and make it of a safer usage, especially during the time period.
Yes, that's just what I was wondering. Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Thank you for this question, which I could talk for a long time about, but I'll try to be succinct. So the idea of the seals was to, as a marker of authenticity, so that if you knew what the proper seal was for a given kind of terra sigillata, you could know it was authentic. So that was there was also in the, there's also some reference both in the initial ceremony on Lemnos and also in the later alchemical idea of the idea of kind of sealing some kind of occult virtue in with a seal, that it kind of seals in some kind of power. And Berthold is really explicit about that the sealing process is imbued with some kind of power in its own right, and that the ritual itself is actually very important to the creation of the terra sigillata. But in terms of the marker, I mean, sometimes I think Carl Dannenfeld has written about the Silesian terra-sigillata, and he describes it as the first trademarked drug, or it could be seen as the first trademarked drug because it is a kind of trademarking. At the same time, the seal didn't mean that there's always these accusations of seals being forged and fraud. So like the very act of adding the seal didn't necessarily mean that it was a guarantor of authenticity, because there was initial skepticism about it as well. And then the final thing to say about that is that because by the 17th century, there were tons of different kinds of terra-sigillata all over Europe and even in parts of Asia as well. And they became collector's items. So this is why if you go to the Basel Pharmacy Museum, like half of it is terra-sigillata. And they were so excited when I came and wanted to see it because most people look at it and are like, what are these dirt discs? Like, I don't understand. And I was really excited about it. And there's several museums around Europe that have these collections of terra-sigillata, which is something I'm really interested in exploring more in the future because they became these collector items where people would try to get pieces from different places in Europe. So that is a very different place than the initial intent of the seal, but I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I was struck by so you could have a classical motif with Diana, but also a Christian one as well.
Yes.
Which was interesting in Reformation Germany.
Yes, yeah, exactly. The Maltese ones with St. Paul on them. Exactly. Yeah, it's a huge variety of them. Absolutely.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
I would add that maybe you saw the there is a mention of the terra sigillata in Ole Worm's Museum Wormiano.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
I don't know if the Copenhagen has any of them remaining.
Yeah, I've been needing to go there. I know Uppsala has a big collection that I haven't gotten to see yet, and I think I've been meaning to talk to Copenhagen as well. But I don't know if you remember, Joe, the conference we were in Barcelona, and we went on the tour of that little apothecary shop from the 17th century. He had a small collection of terra-sigillata, including one from Silesia. So that was pretty cool.
How could I forget that? I mean, that was wonderful conference. What I was wondering also is, you mentioned in Andreas Berthold that he talked about this influence of planets. I was wondering if he's kind of, it was, let's say, more often that it was mentioned, or it was just him that mentioned this, because this kind of this astrological influence is quite interesting.
Yeah, I didn't see that as strongly in Montanus. I saw that mostly in Berthold, and I think it's partially because his seal has the planet. Like he's trying to relate it to his own seal again to bring it back to this idea of authenticity. He was trying to back up the authenticity of that with this description of how the planets function. But I don't know, if he's the only.
So what about, does he mention the sun's influence actually?
Dagmar has been trying to ask a question.
I didn't see it.
The sun is important, just really briefly, the sun is important because Axungia Solis means grease of the sun. So the sun's influence is particularly important because of the gold, its connection to gold and yellow and all of those things. Yeah, exactly.
Dagmar, please ask your question. I didn't see the whole gallery, so I didn't see you. So.
No worries. Anyways, sort of finishing up with Alisha, but I have a question for Jan, and I was just thinking about the idea of using a poison that has been in some sense tamed. So the concept that we also know from Tibetan medicine and alchemy. But what about the practitioner? What about preparing the practitioner for the use of poison? So this is a concept in Indian alchemy, for example, where you go through a long period of preparing the body for the intake of the elixir. So do we have something like that in the traditions that you were looking at?
Thank you. So if I understand your question correctly, Dagmar, you're talking about the preparation of a practitioner's body prior to the ingestion of the poisons, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something I think it's a question, interesting question that more relevant is probably in the context of alchemy than in the context of the medicine. I mean, in medicine in general, surely this is not just applied to the of poisons, for any medicines, there is a correspondence between the constitution of the patient's body and the particular type of either potent or non-potent type of medicines prescribed, right? So that corresponds by the body is weak or strong, female or male, old or young. So there's some kind of general guidelines, but not, in a great detail of the practitioner have to perform a whole series of rituals in order to sort of can tolerate the potency of the elixir. But in the alchemical context, particular the Taoist rituals, I would say there are some alchemical writers. For example, there is this 4th century writer named Ge Hong. He would say, taking an elixir actually, of course, is a great idea. You can become transcendent, but you need to do a lot of things prior to that to make yourself ready. So it's almost like a lifelong practice of the body before your body reaching to the stage of being able to take in these elixirs. And this lifelong practice involves, the bodily exercise, the regulation of diet, but also very importantly, there is a moral cultivation here as well. So you have to do certain things, good, according to whatever guideline offered by Taoist teaching. And only after this series of practices taking a long time, then you'll be able to ingest the powerful elixir eventually and enjoy the benefit. So that I think that's more elaborately explained in certain Taoist texts. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we're close to, well, we're a bit past 6:30 here. It's probably different in your place. If there are other questions, we can quickly take 1 or 2 at the most. What I mean, I still have tons of questions, but maybe I'll ask them privately. But just one quick question for Alisha. I mean, did they ever try to determine what these things contain, or were there tests done for
there's been some work by Greek scientists on the Lemnian Pterosigillata that does sort of show that it has some astringent qualities that actually could probably help ward off poison. Like that may actually have been a reason why a lot of these early modern tests did seem to show it was reasonably efficacious. But I don't know if any, like I know of one study, but I don't know beyond that what's been done.
I mean, the people in Basel could probably do something with so many.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. I should tell. Jan.
Jan, please.
Question, Alisha. Quite interesting. These patients' testimonies collected by Unbold. So
yeah,
and also physicians' testimony. So did you talk about the responses, how the drugs act on the body as a part of the testimony?
Unfortunately, no. They just tend to. I mean, they're more about Wald himself than about the patients. But I do have a correspondence between Wald and Landgrave Georg I of Hessen-Darmstadt, who ordered a bunch of the Panacea Waldina, and it didn't work on him at all. So there's a lot of back and forth about how he should take it, and the Wald's argument was always, well, just if it doesn't work, take more. Like more will help, and you don't need to worry about taking too much. So it's very commercial. But Georg does explain a lot about it, and it's sort of, but it's something that doesn't work. So he's kind of waiting for it to work. But no, the patients just, it's pretty repetitious and mostly just says that like it helped me in whatever illnesses, but it doesn't say like what the method was. But I mean, Wald gave his own, like it was supposed to burn the illness away, like an internal fire, like similar to an internal fire. But the patients don't say that that's what happened.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Well, unless there are more questions, I'm aware it's past the time. Please join me in thanking Alisha and Ian for this wonderful these wonderful presentations that were very enlightening and eye-opening in very many ways. And hope you'll join us again. Next time we will be talking about English alchemy. Stephen Klukas will chair Sara Norja and Zoe Screti to talk about different aspects of medieval and early modern English alchemy. So thank you so much again. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again soon. So maybe
Thanks so much.
Thank you so
at a
much.
Barcelona conference again. That would be lovely. If we ever return to
if we can ever do that again. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, get out of the house. That would be nice.
Thank you,
All
everyone.
right. Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.